Hello, class. Here we are again. We're on chapter 13, and again, I apologize for no video, but the system I had working to record videos isn't working very well for me. So, um, we were chapter 13. We'll talk about variation in political life, kind of social order and disorder, and you can see from the bullet points here some of the things we'll be covering in chapter 13. Okay, so variation in types of political organization. This is definitely going to be, the book was organized in a way that builds up to this because it's going to tie into food getting strategies and social stratification and that sort of thing. But cultural anthropologists recognize four types of political organization, and that's band organization, tribal organization, chiefdom organization, and state organization. And we'll go through each of these, but we'll kind of see how they're tied. Band organization is typically, foraging type society, egalitarian type thing. Tribal organization is going to be, maybe your complex foragers, your horticultural groups, or your pastoral groups. Chiefdom will be, again, kind of horticultural, intensive agriculture, complex foragers, and then state would be more likely intensive agriculture um, or industrial type societies. Table 13.1 on page 307 is a really good table to look at for this chapter and does a good job of organizing some of the things I just mentioned in the previous slide. And again, I didn't mention social differentiation, but or I did a little bit, I guess, but we talked about social stratification, and as you can see in the column there on social differentiation, bands are egalitarian. Your tribal societies are typically egalitarian as well. Chiefdoms are rank societies, and your state societies are class or caste type societies. And then you can also see, your population is going to generally get larger with each of these types of political organization. So this is a good table to take a look at and kind of help you summarize some of the trends and characteristics of these different types of political organization. Okay, so we'll take a look at each of these in a little more detail here. So band organization, it's the community that is the largest group that acts as a political unit. And sometimes it can even be as small as a family. So these are really small groups, again, typically foragers, less than 100 people, typically nomadic, informal leadership. So again, it could be, sometimes they're called a headman, and these are, as I said, informal, so they don't hold like a formal political role or leadership role, but they may have some kind of achieved qualities, so not ascribed, as we learned about in the last chapter. Achieved qualities like hunting, a good hunter, or maybe just someone who is respected by the group for their wisdom and that sort of thing, who may be somebody who leads under certain circumstances but is not a formal leader. So again, they're egalitarian, so no social stratification, and usually foraging type societies. And most likely, since humans were foragers for most of our time on Earth, this is probably the original type of political organization that we see for humans. Okay, for tribal type organization, again, so the population sizes are growing as we go through each of these. So tribal organizations, they tend to be a little more populated and probably a little more sedentary, which means staying in one place, than band societies, but they're still relatively small. And another difference is that there's some multi-local integration, but that it's somewhat informal and not permanent, where the groups will come together under certain circumstances, like maybe some kind of external threat or some kind of food shortage or that type of thing. They'll come together and a lot of times based on kinship as well. So again, the chapters are put in the order they were for a good reason. So we're seeing all these things kind of tie together into this political organization. And with tribal organizations, we still see informal leadership. So won't be again usually some kind of achieved qualities that bring out a leader or leadership for a certain amount of time. And tying into food strategy again and social stratification, pastoral societies, horticultural societies, and again, these groups are typically egalitarian where there's really no social stratification. So again, tied into kinship, so these the tribal type of political organization, as I mentioned, is usually these kind of multi-local integration that informally happens is usually built on kinship. And so a lot of times it's these segmentary lineage systems that will come together for a short amount of time. So this is kind of the way they're organized. So if there's some kind of external threat, again, some kind of emergency food shortage or need for the group to get together, it'll be based on kinship and relationships this way into these kind of lineage segments. And so this is the example that you can read about in the book. Okay, so with Chiefdom Organization, where again the population size is getting bigger, so it's generally bigger than larger communities than your band or tribal types of organizations. And instead of kind of these informal integration, there's more likely to be more of a formal multi-local type group. So again, based on kinship typically. And here we are starting to see some social stratification, and that it's typically a rank society. So if you remember rank societies, there are people that have access to prestige, but not so much power or economic resources. And that person is typically the chief of the chiefdom that has a higher rank than others. And typically, these again are intensive agriculture or horticulture or pastoral societies. Maybe even complex foragers, and so again, we're starting to see some social stratification, larger communities supporting more people. I think, okay, with state organization, I think this is a good slide to mention again. I know I've mentioned Jared Diamond's book Collapse before, but he has another book called Guns, Germs, and Steel that I highly recommend to go along with this class, and it'll talk. And the state society is what makes me think about it, and kind of this slide in the upcoming slides on the origins of state societies and how they came about. But again, you have multi-local group, so connections. Here, definitely a larger population, so we're starting to see cities and towns collected together within a state. And very much specialization among political officials, and very much social stratification. So if you remember, in order to have specialization like this, you're usually talking intensive agriculture or herding or domestic agriculture, domestic raising of animals, that sort of thing. And so not everyone is directly involved in getting food. You have political officials, you have people who make certain items, tools, and that sort of thing. And so if you kind of think about your Western civilization classes or just your history of the world type courses, you can think about kind of the origins, of state societies and kind of how they came about. And again, I recommend Jared Diamond's book as well. So we see the variation that we see in political organizations, again, is usually tied to food getting strategies, and which is related to size of the population, which is related to social stratification, and you see how kinship was built into it too. So with food collectors, foragers, we're more smaller population, band societies, and then as you move kind of our shifts in food getting strategies, which we can also see over the history of humans, from food collectors to maybe horticulture or pastoralism, that sort of thing, onto intensive agriculture, into commercial and industrial and post-industrial and that type of thing, and the shifts in population densities. So again, Jared Diamond's book is good on the spread of state societies, and you can also, there's a good YouTube video of Guns, Germs, and Steel as well. I mean, it's not originally a YouTube video, but you can find it for free on YouTube. That book talks about the spread of state societies and the reasons behind, according to Jared Diamond, why state societies developed where they did. And he has some pretty interesting reasons behind that. So again, I recommend that book. But state level political development has come to dominate the world, and based on our history, we're seeing that eventually the whole world will be politically integrated, which, so it's kind of cultural anthropologists who like to look at cultural variation with globalization and technology and the way things are today. We're seeing less and less variation and more political integration and that sort of thing. So we can look at variation in the political process as it's tied to each of these political organizations. And we've discussed this a little bit already. So in band societies, remember, in tribal societies, leadership is informal. So it's just going to be a lot of times based on achieved qualities. So someone who's a good hunter, someone who is known to be particularly wise in certain circumstances, someone who's maybe a good gatherer or knows the food, where the foods are going to be located during certain times of the year, that type of thing. But in maybe in chiefdom societies, it could be hereditary. Or if we think about even modern England, we have, although they're kind of more of an informal leadership would be, passing down king, queen, that type of thing. So state societies, that's how you get to be a leader. Which they typically had more formal leadership roles in the past than they do today. And then we'll continue to look at this in the following slide, but political participation, again, we kind of covered some of that with some of the different types of political organizations. When the people will participate in political decisions. In these band and tribal societies, it's usually some kind of external threat. Or some kind of emergency situation that causes, based on kinship, for this multi-local integration. With chiefdoms, it's again a hereditary type of thing, where the chief has some kind of say in who will participate and when and that sort of thing. And then I think state and nation-state type societies were more familiar with political participation. So I already mentioned this concept of big men. I haven't said big women yet, and we've talked about gender stratification, and we've talked about kinship. So again, the book is organized in a good way to kind of lead us up to this moment. So big men are typically patrilineal societies, and big women are found more in matrilineal societies. And we talked about how men are typically leaders in most societies. Even in matrilineal, although their leadership may not be as strong or powerful as it is in patrilineal societies. And so these are typically egalitarian societies, so these big men and big women don't really hold formal leadership roles. They're more informal, based on achieved qualities. And the group kind of has these mechanisms where if this big man or big woman started to act in a way that they thought that they had power over people, they would most likely find that that's not the case and would be kicked out of that position shortly thereafter. Again, these are societies that typically are egalitarian, and we see no social stratification. Okay, so resolution of conflict. You could spend a whole course on the anthropology of war, and it's an interesting topic, I think, to look at, peace and violence from a cross-cultural perspective. So maybe you might think of, okay, and it also kind of ties into psychological anthropology or personality and culture. So, some cultures are generally more peaceful, some cultures are generally more aggressive and violent. And so, like, we might think of Switzerland, maybe, as kind of this neutral, peaceful, um, relatively conflict-free type of society, and then you can kind of contrast that with maybe a certain society that you see as violent. So we'll take a look at some of these different types of resolution of conflict from a cross-cultural perspective. Okay, here are some of the ways we can look at, from a cross-cultural perspective, peaceful resolution of conflict. And again, this is going to be based on the type of political organization. And so you can think about it from band, tribal, chiefdom, state societies. And so in peaceful resolution of conflict, you can see avoidance. And you can probably, just based on your own interactions with your friends and family, kind of think about these as well. So avoidance would just be, kind of ignoring as it applies and ignoring the situation, just staying away from each other, that type of thing. Maybe some kind of community action. If it gets to be bad enough, the community will kind of, get a hold of the people involved in this conflict and say, hey, we need to resolve this. And then that could also take place through negotiation and mediation, which are terms that we're familiar with. Kind of a ritual reconciliation in that there's an apology involved. So there's a desire on one or both parts, or how many ever parts there might be, to reconcile and bring back kind of more of a harmonious relationship. And so there might be apologies involved, either just on an individual or kind of a ceremonial communal type stage. There's also oaths and ordeals. I think we're more familiar with oaths. So, kind of this act of calling upon some kind of higher power to say that you're going to behave in such a way. So if we'd say, I swear to God, or we put our hand on a Bible and swear to take an oath to fulfill a certain obligation, that's a type of, can be a type of peaceful resolution of conflict. An ordeal, we're not as familiar with, I don't think, but it's kind of a way to determine guilt or innocence by submitting the accused to dangerous or painful tests that are believed to be under supernatural control. So you might think of the Salem witch accounts of, putting them through a test to find out if they were a witch or not, that sort of thing. Which doesn't sound like a peaceful resolution of conflict, but might be seen as such by those particular people. We're probably most familiar with education, courts, and codified law as ways of peacefully bringing about resolutions of conflict. So although these mediation is common in relatively egalitarian societies, we are familiar with it in our society as well. As you can see here on page 321, we've got a teacher who's trying to peacefully resolve through mediation a conflict between two boys. Okay, so now violent resolution of conflict. It can result in individual violence. So this person is upset with this person and they engage in violence against each other. We see that in all types of these political organizations. Feuding, typically see maybe in band, feuding and raiding we'll see typically in band and tribal organizations, political organization, where you've got, one group feuding with another group. A lot of times it could be based on kinship, that sort of thing. And raiding would be, moving into the other's territory and camp and taking things and coming back. We're familiar with large-scale confrontations, which is at a state-level society or even maybe a chiefdom society, where we might call it war and that type of thing. So the type of warfare in these chiefdom or state societies varies in scope and complexity from society to society. Pre-industrial societies with higher warfare frequencies are likely to have had a history of unpredictable disasters that destroyed food supplies. So again, it might be based on necessity. Sometimes, you might have your own cultural ideals in terms of conflict, but if you're in a pickle, so to speak, might change your ideas on conflict. By the way, if you heard a dog barking at the end of the last slide, that was my dog, not yours, if you happen to have one. Sorry about that. Anyway, with resolution of conflict, again, we've looked at peaceful aspects and violent aspects. Dramatic changes in a political system can occur more or less voluntarily, and we're seeing a lot of dramatic changes right now in political systems from a global perspective. And in recent history, democracy is a striking type of political change in terms of the spread of participatory forms of government. If you have any questions on this chapter, feel free to give me an email, and I'll see you. You'll hear my voice again on chapter 14 next time. Thanks.